Okay, so here we are again. We're still in my kitchen. Hi, this is Tom. Sorry, and you are.
I'm Baldur Bjarnason.
So this is number 3. You'll have heard number 1, you'll have heard number 2, and we're now doing the third one. So you're kind of stuck with us, I think.
And if you haven't heard the other two, then it doesn't really matter because what we're going to say probably won't make sense anyway.
No, absolutely. And if you haven't heard the other two, then how are you hearing this one? Are you subscribing to a thing you haven't? Anyway, yes, beside the point. So when we started this, we had an outline for the first sort of half dozen, and just because, like writing the book, things change as you go along, we're going to deviate from the outline. This is kind of fun. We had a letter from a listener. Actually, we didn't. We had a letter from a reader of the book that accompanies this podcast, or that this podcast accompanies, who could go anonymous, but I could say Mr. GW of Blackfriars wrote in and kind of made a really interesting point, because the book. This is not a book. The book object thing that we wrote that this goes along with obviously has been released as a website and in a variety of forms that Baldur's been working on and has been redesigned since its first launch. But one of the points that was made was kind of the inherent unnavigability or the difference in navigating a print object as regards navigating a digital object. And the point that was being made in this very well written, incredibly well expressed, because that's what he does, email, was the sense in which we kind of felt like an object that had been written for one format and that was being put into another format, and it maybe wasn't kind of matching the two completely, or matching kind of a way of reading that was completely natural, which I think we agree with and we understood, because our intention was always that this at some point becomes a physical book, but for the moment, just frankly to get it read, we'd like to have it out there, and it's a website. So that long kind of preamble is really my way of saying that what I want to talk about, or we want to talk about today, is what does print do and what does digital do? And to use that as a way of talking about what print could become in digital, or what digital could do that print doesn't do. And just try and... That was a very messy way of saying we need to kind of unpick that mess a little bit.
Well, just to begin with, in this is not a book. One of the things that struck me when I go through it, and I alternate between the single-page version, which is probably the closest approximation to the book reading experience that we have on the site, and the other version, is that there are parts of it that work a lot better once it's atomized, and there are parts of it that work a lot better when it's a part of a long single argument. So it's not an either or. It becomes a different thing. There are points in it that become weak in one form but are strong in another, and vice versa. So, like for example, there are a few of the parts where we do like a rapid fire series of advice. Each one is a well-contained nugget. That works really well, atomized on the website. You can just link to it and people to it, and there's a single piece of advice that's concrete and actionable that they can see on the website. But the bits of it that lay out an argument, that, like for example, the when we're talking about building up sort of our vision of how to approach narrative structure, or trying to, or where we're trying to figure out how to emphasize with the reader. Those parts work a lot better when they are presented as a part of the whole. So the thing that I'd say that print can, that digital can do, that print has difficulties with, is that it can do both. As in, you can offer digital much more easily in a variety of forms and representations. But I haven't linked to it from the site itself. But I've got a PDF version of the entire thing that anybody could download and is kept up to date with a regular site. That's another reading experience. So that if I had to pick one thing that I'd sort of say was the strength of digital. That would be the sort of dynamic adaptability.
And in that, because while you were talking, one of the things I wanted to quickly lay to rest was this is not just about line length. It's not just about the length of a paragraph, the length of a page, or saying that, there are some things that we make in a bigger argument. It's actually about, and you and I talked a little bit about this when we were writing it, it's about the arguments that we're making and the way in which we want to make those arguments. And some things sort of do lend themselves to that kind of more punchy, I don't want to say PowerPoint, but that kind of almost kind of that sort of contained argument, that contained thing that goes, here's a thing, and here's another thing, and here's another thing, and here's another thing, and we're going to link to these things, or you can read them in your own order. But as you say, there are some sections of it that do demand a more kind of considered reading experience, a more kind of a longer form. And I think maybe just to kind of address weaknesses in digital, if I can kind of throw that in for a second, maybe those things don't work as well on a website because you're scrolling up and scrolling down and you can't kind of keep... One of the things I think is... Actually, okay, let's put it another way. One of the things I think is true about reading a book is the sense of the physical object, of your kind of haptic relationship to a physical object. That, we can look at the... This is an argument for Peter Mayer. Thank you, Peter. It's a brilliant book. We can look at the end of a book, we can look at the spine of a book, and we can turn the thing around, and we can pretty much know where we're turning to. We know when we're looking for a certain thing in it.
Yeah.
And that I think certainly isn't true on the website. It's more difficult to do. It's a more difficult kind of engagement with the text and with the arguments there. And I think one of the problems I continually have with ebooks is making it's not even a bookmark, because bookmarking isn't enough. Bookmarking is not a natural for me way to do things within a digital environment. It feels kind of that I'm forcing a relationship with a marker in a text in a string file, and then forcing myself to kind of go back into it. What I want to do is look at a book and go, it's about halfway through.
Here it's sort of slight forewarning, because we're entering into a territory here that I have been angry about for years. And that is the fact that a lot of the limitations of digital are self-inflicted.
Right.
Because one of the things that we have with print that people, especially people who design software, don't realise, is that print has embodied navigation.
Yeah.
It's you have you have an almost abstract concept mapped out on a concrete 3D object. And one of the biggest mistakes that people keep doing in when they map text onto create these reading applications is that they boil it down to just the text. They forget that that text has never existed in isolation. It's always been a part of some sort of form of navigation that's always explicit and can never be dismissed.
Yeah.
And what they do now is that they take the text, they boil everything away, and they hide all the navigation. They hide. Like when I stare at a screen, and there's a tiny number in the corner that has absolutely no meaning to me about where I am in the book. It does not map on anything. It doesn't register. I have no clue. No clue whatsoever. What if I'm on the phone with the changing font sizes and everything, what does page 200 out of 600 mean? Sure. It doesn't mean a thing. And what they do is that they've systematically stripped away all of the navigational features that we as developers, as user interface designers, have learned throughout the years are necessary. Progress bars, a constantly explicit structure, as in you always have the navigation, you always have the landmarks visible, you make sure that you see everything all the time so that people can build a map of it in their heads. But we keep hiding everything, and we make ebooks useless because we hide their structure, we hide them away, we just show the text and we cripple them. And there's no... It's amazing that ebooks have managed to get the traction that they have, all things considered, because if you go through all of these apps, they've all completely and utterly and systematically destroy everything that's useful about memorizing, about learning, about building a structure of sort of internalizing the structure of the book. And it's infuriating that people have been making this point that this is something to be fixed, and that this is holding ebooks back. People have been talking about this for years, ever since the first Kindle came out. And it was always when the first Kindle came out and the iBooks first came out, there was always this talk. Oh, they're gonna fix it in the next version. But the next version, they strip out more. They take out more of the navigation. They take out more, and it, like you said, adding a bloody bookmark, just pasting it onto there with no meaning, with no affordances. There's no user interface affordance involved with these bookmarks. It is just, it's making a mockery of the entire thing.
It's making. Actually, we should just kind of acknowledge it, and it's Peter Mayer's break. Have you read Peter Mayer's Breaking the Page?
I kept up with his blog that he was keeping while he was writing it, but I haven't actually read the book.
Right.
So, I'm pretty sure that he's probably, there's a lot more in the book than there is was in the blog, because that was mostly sort of notes and observations.
Possibly. I mean, I read it this week. Craig Modd, I think, and Peter Mendelsohn tweeted it or recommended it, and I thought, okay, no, it's out. And I think I'd remembered, like you, there was a blog, and I'd been reading little bits of it, and it kind of fell by the wayside for me. But he devotes a big chunk of, and it's a really interesting book, and that we should actually just say this in terms of recommending other people's work. For goodness sake, just turn this thing off, go and download that. It'll cost you £6 and just read it because it's good, and we're good as well. But anyway, he devotes a good chunk of, I think, the first third of the book to really addressing copyright pages on the Kindle, because there's a whole load later on which we'll come on to in terms of thinking about the navigation and the physical navigation of a book and the digital navigation he's saying what you said, but what he's interestingly doing is also providing a way around that and a way to rethink it, which for me was kind of something really valuable about that book.
Cool.
But he does do something really, and it is tied into this location something of something within a Kindle, or the percentage of the book, because it's about, for me and for Mayers, there's a kind of a hierarchy of reading. I'm much less interested in the copyright page than I am in the content of the book, but the Kindle doesn't give any kind of differentiation between that.
No.
And as he points out, we can, the book he kind of looks at, and I think it's a Penguin text, actually gives, because it doesn't change the type size within the copyright page, everything is completely uniform with the rest of the book, then we can find the home addresses of every division of Penguin across the whole world, given the same kind of priority, the same kind of hierarchy as the text of the book itself, which is just sort of simple and obvious and easy, but completely ridiculous, completely stupid. And then he then proceeds to kind of pick apart the way in which we read. And as I say, interestingly, later on, then proposes a whole different way of imagining the way you might engage with a library, rather than engage with a library as the Kindle presents. And I've got just opened my phone here and gone, yes, there is obviously a library on my Kindle, and it's kind of pointless. It's dull. It shows me what I've read. It shows little dots on what I'm halfway through or what I gave up on. But there is nothing. There's no sense of organisation. There's no sense of this book corresponds to this. There's no sense of metadata about what this is about. I've not been able to kind of annotate that and give myself. And this does come back to, we could walk 20 feet and go into the study, and I could look at the books and go, that book is about that, that's there, that's next to that one because it's located to that one, that's my current to-be-read shelf, or shelf and a half. But there's none of that within a digital device, and that for me seems to be one of the things that print objects do well, because we have this kind of mnemonic relationship with them. We have a kind of unconscious response to a print object and an unconscious relationship with the history of it and our history with it, and where we put it on the shelf, that we should be able to do that with a digital device. Well,
we should. Richard Nash, a Future Book last year, he presented a sort of an idea, which I don't think he actually presented that well at Future Book. But in the pub afterwards, he actually came up with an excellent sort of catchphrase for it, is that a digital library should be like Fitbit for your mind.
Okay.
As in, it's the Kindle. It not only has an overview of your entire library, it should be able to tell you, I mean, how much time you spend in each genre, or sort of what sort of book by what sort of author engages you more in terms of annotation and reading and bookmarking and all that. It should give you something. One of the things that digital should give you that print can't is a much more analytical overview of how you engage with your books if you want it, because that's something that that digital can do to make up for the lack of this sort of physical interaction.
Which suddenly opens up this, because one of the questions that's dominated, one of the debates that's dominated digital and publishing for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's kind of gone away this year, I suppose it's still there, is big data. And data from reading, and the scare story that went around about 6 months ago, that a publisher would then, a writer or a publisher or an agent or editor would know how far people got through a text. And so if you stopped at page 121 of Nick Harkaway's Tiger Man, then Nick would be suddenly inspired to change page 122 because that's where everybody stopped. But that's that being presented as, quite rightly, something that's incredibly wrong, incredibly kind of broken about. But actually, what you're suggesting, I think what Myers is getting to as well, is that data about our reading is not a bad thing.
No.
But data that's not presented to the reader, data that's not used in any way that goes, okay, this is how you read.
The problem is entirely with data that you don't have ownership over.
Right. Okay.
So if your reading creates data in the cloud for some publisher or a retailer, that's a problem, because that is they're basically sort of getting sort of part mythological superstition. They're hijacking your shadow self.
Yeah.
That sort of, they've got a piece of your soul that they captured and are keeping up in the cloud. But data that you have on your own devices that you control, it's like I use an app to track my sleeping.
Right.
I turn on that, put the iPhone next to my pillow, and it tells me the quality of sleep, whether I've tumbled and turned and all that, and it rocks from 60% quality up to 85% quality, depending on what's going on.
Okay.
And obviously that data is not going anywhere.
No.
But because it's data that I chose to collect and I chose to map, that has value to me, because it affects what I do just before I go to sleep and all that.
Completely.
And the same thing applies to reading.
Yes, and I think the point being that we're not, as readers, we're not being allowed to see that data. We're not, or actually, not even that we're not being allowed to see it. We're given no useful way of passing that data into something that's useful. That data exists.
There's no bargain there. There's no agreement. There's just taking.
There's just taking, and there's no. I mean, this may be. I mean, actually, this is, people talk about the killer app for books. That may be the killer app for books. That someone turns around and goes, we're going to track your reading. We're going to track how you read. We're going to look at where you're reading certain things. Which, of course, for me, at least, is artificial, because I tend to have a digital copy and a print copy, and the digital copy is there for convenience. But what I read is not in kind of a regular order. But actually, maybe that's the killer app for books, in terms of changing the way you read and giving you something that, or giving you a richer reading experience in a broader sense, in a kind of meta sense, rather than thinking about, we can still keep it. Okay, let's say we can't fix text and illustration and whatever else, but we can change how you engage with a library of books. We can change how you engage with a digital library and how you might use that content and use that data. And I mean, the other thing is, I'm an academic, and I work with the library at the university, and I work with libraries a reasonable amount. And that data, their way of looking at it is similarly broken. There appears to be no way to. They're interested in, and the tools we have, they tell you how many times students access a journal. They tell you what the search terms were. They don't tell you anything about how they read it. They don't tell you anything about what they did with it and how it's.
It's because they can't measure those parts.
But also because the systems don't exist to allow them to measure those parts. Yeah. And for me, that's. There was an email that kind of came around 3 or 4 days ago saying we're no longer going to subscribe to these journals because they've not. Students looked at 4 articles in this journal and no articles in this journal and 1 article in this journal. Therefore, we're going to cancel the subscription. And I thought, well, from a purely economic point of view, okay, fine. From an actual user point of view, from a kind of usability, because these are not useless pieces of academic journal. Although maybe that's a different conversation. maybe there's something about how we're directing them and how we're directing students and what they can do with it that actually is more useful and more valuable to kind of bring out from them. But anyway, that's kind of, it's a side point.
Well, there's an anecdote here that I always bring up when the discussion of ebook data and data collection comes up, and you've heard it. I've probably told it to you a dozen times. But it's a story about Umberto Eco's library, and it basically goes as you've said this repeated this story several times. But the core of the story is the idea that there is a huge amount of value in the books you haven't read. That a library of books that you haven't read is an asset. It's something. It's information that it's always going to be there at your fingertips. It's something you can delve into when the need arises, and it's information you don't have to carry around in your head. So while there might be some value for a publisher to be worried if people keep buying their fiction books but don't read them, which I think is almost certainly the case, for example, with almost all literary fiction. That's entirely bought as show-off fiction. Yeah. But if you're doing you can't apply the same logic to non-fiction, because non-fiction is even unread is an asset. It is a sort of a information captured in amber, and its value lies in being there when you have a problem, when you have a question, and you need to find out, what does X say about Y, that specific problem, and that's why there's a huge risk whenever you engage in data collection of short-termism. Because valuable data tends only to be surfaced in the long term, because short-term data is almost always noise. Yeah. And it's just a standard practice whenever you do research, is that the longer you can monitor things, the more sound the results are, because the day-to-day variations so it can be so massive and random. Yeah. So there's a huge risk if publishers would start relying on these things, that they would miss out on the books whose value might seem low in the short term, but to the reader would have massive value in the long term when something comes up that means that they need it. Yeah. But the one thing that I do find interesting is that I've actually been sort of involved as a consultant on a couple of on an analytics effort, so one thing that I find interesting is that if you present readers with a bargain, with a deal, as in saying you get this book for free, in exchange we can follow your reading, but only if you actually click and say send the information. If you present people with that bargain, readers are a lot more open to the idea, and even to the degree where they obsessively click the link that sends in information at every bloody chapter, just to make sure that they're keeping up their part of the deal, which is. So if you present them with a bargain that they understand, that they find to be fair, then that becomes a completely different thing. That becomes something that people can appreciate. And the other thing that's interesting about those efforts is the fact that publishers, they aren't really interested in. I just sort of need to be careful how I word this. Well, fuck it. They aren't interested in anything that's actually useful. All of the data, all of the analytics that they're interested in are vanity metrics. They want data that can make their ego feel good, as in that people have read. This amount of people have read the book towards the end. They are not interested in things like how big a percentage of the people who read that book were converted into buyers for the next book.
Now I agree with you. That's actually far more valuable data. That's the.
Well, it's got a monetary value attached to it, a literal dollar, monetary value.
Completely, but I think I want to take issue with the vanity thing on the first thing you said, because I think what's been focused on are the easy answers, the simple answers, and this is something in terms of the next one of these that we do, and I've got in my head there's an argument about the future and the present that kind of runs around that. But actually, I think one of those things, one of the things that drives that kind of data collection is, okay, today is all about me putting things a different way. Publishers take risks all the time. Every advance, no matter how small it is a risk on an author's return. On, you know, you're going to sell X copies of this book, and therefore we're going to give you this amount of money. It's going to cost us this to produce, and this to ship, and this to market, and this to go into Waterstones or Amazon, and we're going to get our money back. And that's a risk. That's a calculated risk. And actually, I think one of the reasons for that kind of short-termism of data is that's all driven by kind of mitigating and understanding that risk, so that we can figure out, you know, marketing can be confident that X number of people read 3/4 of the way through this novel, and they will probably come back and buy another one, even though we don't have any real data on that. But we can be confident that they've read enough of it through, or we can get sales figures, or we can get reading figures, or we can get browsing figures, because that's about mitigating that financial risk. It's not about changing their behaviour.
Yeah.
And maybe that's actually the thing that I'm interested in terms of what we do with data, that we can change a reader's behaviour and we can give them information, and useful information about what they do. And as your example about using your phone to monitor your own sleep, and therefore that kind of may change what you drink in the evening, may change what you eat, may change your habit of the last hour before you go to bed, all of which is really valuable for you as an individual. Mm-hmm. But the device is giving you that data, and maybe that we're not as interested as an industry, and including myself in that, or we're not interested enough in helping readers and helping people.
We're not interested at all.
Right. Okay.
It's one of the things that I keep bringing this up when I talk to people, and it keeps getting ignored. The standard. We are complete as an industry. We are completely invested in the idea that the book has inherent value. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't serve the reader, because the book has value. And meanwhile, readers are going to YouTube, and they're solving their problems by going to YouTube. It's like if you're getting into one of the things I did the other day was I dug up a few of my old fountain pens. Right. Which have been sitting in a box for years, and decided to go and clean them and prepare them and ink them up and get them all ready. Mm-hmm. And the best resource for how to clean your fountain pens and prepare them and do things and reviews for what inks to buy and all that is YouTube.
YouTube, absolutely.
And for absolutely any given hobby or interest or anything that you used to go to the library or bookstore for. People go to YouTube now first, and it's like we're losing an entire generation of potential readers because they always go to YouTube first, and we aren't even trying to solve their problems. There's no interest even in trying to say, instead of doing this book about this non-fiction subject, let's start off by testing, by putting together a series of YouTube videos to see if there's an audience. It's sort of. Publishers are stuck on the idea that they are a manufacturer of a specific format instead of solutions. Yeah. This ties back into the old sort of analogy that I've denigrated myself so often about the whole buggy whip versus people in the carriage industry not realizing that they were in the transport industry. Yeah. There's a little bit of that. But there's the risk of you have to decide for yourself whether you are if the value of what you do lies in the book, then you need to focus on the book. You need to focus on creating well-made, well-bound, excellent paper editions that are almost artisanal. That you need to, and basically you need to raise your prices. You need to turn it into a thing that's of its own. Yep. But if what you're interested in is solving people's problems, then the book isn't really the best solution for that. For the most cases, I mean, it's rare that making a book is the simplest and easiest way to solve somebody's problem.
Sure. So maybe one of the things about publishing is that, as you say, if you're in the book industry, then I'm going to paraphrase it. If you're committed to the book industry, then really think about what that is. But actually, if you're in the communicating ideas, maybe that's what it's certainly one of the things that publishing comes down to. It's communicating an idea, it's communicating an expression, it's communicating a story. But actually, there are, and I don't want to turn all publishers into filmmakers, and that's not the answer. And that's definitely not. What I don't want to do is say publishers get out of the industry, because there are more. There are maybe. If you're going to grow your audience, if you're going to keep your slice of that, and the figure that was quoted to me 2 weeks ago was 3.3 billion in international sales over a year. If you want your slice of that and not see that kind of diminish year on year going forward, you've got to think about how you bring an audience to it, and how you kind of change your audience's relationship with the thing that actually gets you the money in the finish. And that may be commissioning video. It may be completely changing the way you pre-market something. And one of my bugbears at the moment is marketing, and is the way books, not as much books are marketed, because
they aren't marketed. It's basically just they do PR for books that already have traction.
Yes, PR is done incredibly well, and there's some very talented people and very smart people working in PR. But actually, the notion of how do you market a book, and how do you bring an audience, and how do you build an audience, and this is a different podcast. And maybe we need to bring a writer in. Is how do you as a writer build an audience, and how is it your responsibility? Is it your publisher's responsibility? Is it your agent's? Where does that sit? And how actually is that sitting sensibly, and is that in any way being served by technology at the moment? And that is definitely a different argument. Anyway, we said, go on, you have
the only point I wanted to make was the fact that probably the safest part of the publishing industry today is narrative prose, as in novels and narrative non-fiction, like autobiographies and biographies, because those are just really well suited to print and ebooks, and it's a medium that a form of storytelling that's been around for ages, and it's not likely to disappear. No. So it's more everybody else in publishing that's going to be worried, because it's more everybody else who are basically whose business hinges on delivering value to the reader, rather than sort of delivering a specific form of storytelling to the reader. They're the ones who have to be worried. The people who are doing novels, there's probably good. I mean, the novel survived the radio, it survived film, it survived TV, it survived computer games, it survived the first 25 years of the web. It's not likely to diminish that much over the long term, which is why the whole discussion about the ebook versus print transition is such nonsense, because it's just basically shifting this. You got a jar full of marbles, and it's basically you've got the same number of marbles, and you're shifting them slightly back and forth. Yeah. It's all the same readership. It's just a matter of how they're being served depends on almost on fashion from year to year. What devices are out. What distribution's going on. So it's there's people keep focusing on the novel, and they keep focusing on narrative prose, but those are the parts of the book industry that are I think are going to be the most stable, and they're tiny as well. They're such a tiny part of the industry.
They are. Well, there's certainly the bits that don't. Looking at the numbers in the Guardian and Sunday Times at the weekend of sales figures, they're the numbers that hit in the low thousands. They're not hitting in the tens. 20,000, with obviously some exceptions.
Well,
there's event books, but
there's an open secret in the UK publishing industry, which is basically that if you can manage to break even at selling 400 copies, then publishing is a no-brainer, because 400 copies is about what a first novel sells.
Sure. Okay, so that's the measure.
Do you want to know how much a first novel in Iceland sells?
Go on.
Probably around the order of about 5 times that. That's
really?
Yeah.
In Iceland?
Yeah.
And these are novels published by Icelandic authors?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're talking about first-time authors. Repeat authors quite frequently get up into the 3, 4. But the big-name authors, they do sell in tens of thousands.
Okay.
So it's just Icelanders read books. The British don't read books. They are anti-intellectual to a fault.
I want to dwell on this. Is this... These are figures are these true for all the Nordic countries, or are these just you've got them for Iceland? I
have no idea what the numbers are for the other Nordic countries. These are about 3 or 4 year old figures done by It was a study done by the collaboration between the Bookseller Association in Iceland and the Publishers Association.
Wow!
And I think even the Writers Union was in there as well.
Okay, because we're talking about a country that has a population of
340,000,
which is a reasonable amount less than the United Kingdom.
Just a little bit
In terms of an order, I mean, yes, you could let
Icelanders really love their books. They just really, really love their
more
books.
people voted in the Labour leadership election than are in the population of Iceland.
Yes.
Okay, and a first novel sells 4 or 5 times more than it does in the UK.
On average. I mean, there are first novels that do really well in the UK as well, but
Yeah,
they're in the minority.
Yes, but they're in a minority compared to a country that kind of habitually sells and reaches that, which I know we've seen.
I mean, there's a downside to this in Iceland. The problem with the Icelandic book industry is that there is absolutely no backlist. Nothing is kept in print.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
If you didn't buy the book, in the year that it was brought out, there's a good chance that the only way you can get it is buying a used copy.
And is that tradition, or is that because there is no...
It's tradition because there's just the market can do both at the same time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's not. There's no culture of stories. There's no culture of first editions, or there's a culture of first. This is the way it is done. Mm.
Yeah. I mean, if the industry had it the keeping the backlist around comes at a cost of the new books.
Yeah.
So if they decided to keep all of these books around, then we'd have fewer new books.
Okay.
So it's just they decided let's just do a new thing every year because people buy new things, people love new things.
Yeah.
And obviously it helps that there's a lot of media around books in Iceland. We've got primetime TV shows and loads of coverage on all of the newspapers and all of that. So it's a different balance. I mean, it's sort of you can imagine how the UK publishing industry would change if they decided that they would just completely ditch the backlist and just focus on new books. It would completely change. It would be horrifying to a degree,
yeah.
But mainly because the UK has such a massively large history of interesting books.
Yes.
But Iceland also has a very long history of being inveterate novelty seekers.
Right.
Almost all of the traditions that we tell people, that we tell tourists, are long. They were invented sort of after World War II. And it's like, for example, there's a thing called Þorrahátíð, which is where a traditional festival where everybody comes together and eats Icelandic food. That was invented in the 80s. Right. We keep telling foreigners and tourists that this is something that's been a long-term tradition. But no, Iceland really loves new things. We pick up new things at the drop of a hat, and we drop the old just like there's no love of tradition.
I just want to interrogate that number again a little bit more because I'm kind of slightly... We've talked about the Icelandic book industry before, but you never actually said that to me. So how many new... These are first-time novelists. How does that compare in terms of numbers of books published from Iceland to the UK? Are we talking? I mean, proportionally, is that an equivalent?
I think we've got a world record of new titles published per capita per year.
Right. Okay.
Sort of something on the. I mean, it's sort of where the average.
I'm doing my defend the UK bit here, and we can't be that bad. We can't be that Philistine, but apparently we are.
Well, yeah. I mean, the UK publishing industry is compared to France or Germany. You're a bunch of Philistines. I mean, it's sort of like this idea that UK civilized. No, you're not. You're a bunch of Philistines. You don't buy books. You don't read books. You don't even watch good movies. You refuse to watch subtitled things except when there involves a shitload of murders every episode. You're a bunch of Philistines. And the Americans are just ever so slightly worse. So
that makes me feel better.
I know,
okay,
but it's sort of... But if you go to Germany or France or Denmark or any of the other countries, they translate a lot more books. They publish a lot more books per capita. The German book market is huge. It's massive, and it's sort of it's. I mean, the idea that the UK publishing industry is somehow preeminent. It's not. It's not even the big. It's not even the most interesting one in Europe.
Okay.
So anyway, just sort of to deflate people's people a bit.
That's a whole different episode of this whole thing of pulling apart different... Anyway, right. So, right, on that...
Where were we? What were we talking about?
We started by saying we would interrogate a little bit of what print does and what digital does. And the other reason for doing this, I suppose, is something I wrote for Future Book.
The manifesto.
The manifesto. So Philip Jones of Future Book put out a call...
People keep calling it poetic.
What?
The manifesto, a poetic manifesto.
Or mine.
Yeah.
That's because it rhymes.
Yeah, well, you know,
It's meant to be spoken aloud. There's a whole Kate Tempest thing going on in my head, or there was when I was writing it. Anyway, so just to give a background, Philip Jones put a call for 500-word manifestos for the future of publishing, the future of the book, which I think is a kind of... Anyway, that's a different podcast. And I wrote this thing that was kind of, as what I tend to do, a kind of spirited defence of what we've got is not good enough, and what we've got is really not what was promised, which goes back to conversations you and I have had for 15 years. But there's a line in it that I thought chimed with our semi-anonymous reader, that I said, digital is capable of things that print cannot do, and it cannot do what print can. And it's something that I hadn't kind of articulated in that way until I wrote it. It was almost stream of consciousness writing, and what kind of got published was not the first draft, but was very close to a first draft of an awful lot of that. And the point where halfway through the manifesto I said enough, stop rhyming, is actually because I ran out of rhymes. And I couldn't think of a way to keep the sequence going, and I'm much more in awe of poets than I usually am. But I suppose that was the thing I really wanted to spend a little bit of time on with this podcast, is thinking about what does digital do that print cannot do, and what can't it do that print can do? And I think we've done that a little bit in terms of the way we read and our kind of relationship to the physical object, and our relationship to kind of the form of the thing, and how we unconsciously navigate and unconsciously kind of find our way to content, and have a relationship with a book, a set of books, and how sort of imperfect that is in terms of our relationship with the digital equivalent. But I'm just wondering whether, in the last sort of 20 minutes of this, was there anything more we want to say about that? Anything that we haven't?
Well, I mean, the thing I keep coming back to for digital as its core strength is its dynamism. It's sort of like the tactic that we've been using with This Is Not a Book, which is that we keep updating it. We've, like for example, one thing I did over the weekend is I went through the book and I standardised on our hyphen usage, which had been inconsistent. It's sort of hyphens and dashes and sort of style guide-ish things. We doing a bit of corrections. We wrote a bit of one part which I thought wasn't clear, and it's just so much easier to do that in digital. And the thing that I'd like to remind people is the fact that they can feed each other. Like the fact that I can at any time now decide to do a print copy of our site with all of the all of the edits and all of the fixes and all of the corrections, and then we can have the print version, which has all of the strengths and all of the benefits and all of the assets that print has.
Yeah.
So we can have both things. It's not an either or, and it's the core question that everybody, whether you're a writer or a publisher or anything else, has in the long term, is how can you set this up so that instead of fighting each other, how do we set up digital and print so that they feed into each other, so that it becomes a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious cycle of decline. So what we want to, in the long term, is we want print books that feed into digital and cause people to engage more into digital sites. We want digital projects whose engagement feeds into and improves and benefits print. We want these things to become symbiotic rather than parasitic. And it's so easy for us it's so easy to present these two as a dichotomy, as eternally in conflict, where one has to win and the other one has to lose, when the true a true vision of the situation is the fact that these things are feeding to each other. They build on each other. They're like two sides of a pyramid propping each other up, and it's just that's pretty much it. Let's not try to the fact that they each have their strengths is a good thing, because they then complement each other.
But to do that, and we're talking about non-fiction because we're talking about the book we just written.
Yeah,
we've actually got to change and this is one thing that we've done with this book, is change our relationship with the written object and the printed object or the digital object. That we're not. One of the things that you and I said before, I think we said it in the first podcast, is for us, right at the fundamental root of it, and there are a lot of fundamental roots about this, in terms of a big tree that grows out of us. Anyway, there's a Swedish TV series, is that the current ebook workflow is at some point, an author writes a book, and at some point a digital version is hived off from what will become the print version, and that's what you get, which is your thing, put with much less nuance than you did, about the ascendancy of just the text, and just the text is what's kind of driven within that. But actually, one thing that we did with this book was completely change our relationship to how it was being written and how we saw the digital version as opposed to the print version, in a way that because for me, in terms of what we've got, a print edition right at the moment is a very imperfect thing. That it needs, for me, it needs a lot of thinking about the way information flows across pages, the way we kind of pace the reading in that. And as much as I'm kind of completely in awe of the work you've done and the fact that you can generate, no, absolutely, I'm not being flippant about this. Whether you can generate a PDF of everything that's on that site as the full text version, the Instapaper friendly one, that for me is still not the print version. The print version is a different object and a different animal entirely, and it kind of I don't think it needs rewriting. It needs really considering how we read in print and how we operate in print, because there are, as we said right at the start of this, there are sections of this book that were designed to be read as short provocations that are much more kind of McLuhan-y in terms of they're just there to be awkward and annoying and to say,
prod you into action.
Well, you can prod you into, but just to say that there are transmedia is Zieg Sputnik. It's excess, that it's throwing. That there are things in there that I know I wrote that are me not trying to be clever per se, but me trying. That there is something here that's kind of contained in a 3 or 4 sentence thing. Yeah. That for me, when I was envisaging the print version, that's all there is on that page. There is just that thing on that page, and there is kind of white space around that. And for me, this does go back to one thing that print does that digital finds very hard to do, and this also opens up a whole different set of things, is actually really work with page layout and really work with typography and work with design. And you and I had a conversation, I think at the start of this year, that I was looking at, and I still am looking at producing. I work with artist books a lot, and I work with artists, and I teach artists. And one of the things that they make are books. Artists make books, and they make books in limited editions and small runs because they're often handmade, or they're produced partly by hand and partly automatically, partly automated. And these tend to be quite illustration or pictorial or visually heavy. They're often very, very carefully designed objects. And we had because I didn't kind of know how this would translate, and we had a discussion that essentially, as I recall, boiled down to, it's going to be a PDF. You can't do any of that. You can't do any of that. You have none of that control. You have none of that kind of control over the real estate that is the page in a Kindle, and you can't dictate anything.
Yeah. I mean, an art book, when you translate it into digital, becomes one of two things. Either it becomes a fixed layout PDF style thing. It doesn't matter really what actual format it uses. It's going to look the same. It's going to be a static snapshot. Yeah. Or it becomes a DeviantArt profile page.
Right.
It's here I am on an online community of artists. Here's my profile page and a gallery of my stuff.
Sure.
It becomes one of those two things, and there's very little scope for anything beyond those two things.
No, and an artist book is neither of those two things.
Yeah, it's completely different. It's a completely unique expression.
Well, it is. I mean, and there's a colleague of mine. So this is definitely a mention for Ian Chamberlain, who won't listen to this ever because Ian won't do podcasts. Actually, he might do. Who remarks that Ian's a printmaker, and he makes really exquisite, beautiful prints he's an illustrator, printmaker. And Ian's kind of remarked, any student who wants to work in artist books is you just cut the value of your work by a tenth.
Okay.
Because you sell an individual print of a piece of work, you can sell that for 100 quid.
Yeah, okay.
Or 40 quid, or 80, because it's in a series of 10 or 15 or 20, and there is a market for print, there's a market for art in that respect. You put that into
sell them online as well.
Sell them online. You put that into a book, and suddenly you can't shift the book for anything more than the cost of one of those. The book has to have 15 pages or 20 pages, and you can't sell a book for more than 20 quid, 30 quid. Maybe 100 quid if it's a really limited run. And Ian's constant line is that, monetarily, artist books make no sense. Yeah. They're a vanity thing.
This reminds me of ages ago. I was reading a blog post by a photographer, and he was telling the story about. I think it might even have been the website called The Online Photographer. I can't remember exactly. He was telling the story about how he was going to his local school, I think the high school that he used to graduate, and he was returning there for a reunion or something. And he was walking down one corridor, and he just saw lining the wall were all of these classic prints of these classic photographs. Ansel Adams and just classic photographs. And it was just really nice looking prints. And he kept looking through them and was like, oh God, how do you afford buying all of these prints? And these look so good. And he asked one teacher, he said, no, what we did, we just bought a book, a photo book, and we cut it up and framed the pages.
Right.
And it's sort of like, yeah, I mean, it's just printing has the quality of printing had increased to such an extent that they could do that. And it's sort of, it's what you said in a nutshell, almost a little bit too explicitly, but it is going along those lines. I mean, sometimes you just have to choose whatever form or medium maximizes your benefits. I mean, it's just sometimes it might be best for artists just to opt out of books,
which I would find
depressing.
Well, yeah, absolutely depressing, absolutely disheartening, because the book is, for me, the book is an object. The book is a thing. The book is something that especially the dog-eared paperbacks I've owned for 35 years are an object. They're a thing, and I have a history. Back to this. I have a history with the object.
Souvenirs.
They're souvenirs of a life lived, and one of the reasons I buy the books, some of the books I buy now, is because they are objects. They're absolutely beautiful design. I mean, I've got some. Okay, good. This is perfect for podcasting because nobody can see a damn thing. Because we're in a kitchen and you're listening to audio. I've got a thing by Ginkgo Press called The Art of the Book, and it's absolutely beautiful. So there's a pink elastic ribbon that comes around it. There's a piece that opens out. There's a.
Is that like a brochure? That's sort of like.
It's a brochure of the whole book.
That's attached to the book. Bound in the book.
Sewn onto the cover.
That looks really nice.
Because this is a catalogue of bookmakers.
Ooh.
And book designers' work, and it's been treated with the same kind of care and the same kind of attention as an artist does to an artist's book.
Is that Coptic stitch binding?
It's
yes,
yeah,
sewn. That's very nice.
Sewn. I mean, obviously it's automated. There's a machine that does this, but it's
it's properly sewn. That's not the mass sewn in China that falls apart like one publisher.
No, it's a collection. It's a collection of artists' books, and it's a really, aside from the smell of print, which is still a thing, it's just a really beautiful piece of design, and this is what Ginkgo do incredibly well. Obviously, this isn't a 10 quid paperback.
No,
this is a 40 quid hardback thing that sits there.
Even the paper looks nice, just on its own.
Even the paper is good, but that's for that. I can't imagine, and this is a conversation that you and I had earlier in the year. I can't imagine that thing existing digitally. For that thing to exist digitally, it's a very imperfect website.
Yeah.
Because it has none of what I want to do when I'm reading it is to flick back between something called Not the End of Print, which is describing a set of books with foiling gold edging and looking inside and showing me bits, with looking forward to books about food and design, to bouncing back. And I want the physical relationship with the thing. I want to see the artist's sketches, and that means I'm looking at a page layout. I'm looking at a thing that opens out on a left-hand and a right-hand page. I can see the whole thing, and I can see the typography, I can see the way it's designed, because somebody has clearly very thought about this incredibly clearly and incredibly carefully, and made something that operates as an object and operates as a book. And we go from that, and I have McSweeney's 24. And McSweeney's are amazing, because that's what they do, and every edition is designed differently, and this is I think it's called a Z fold.
Oh God, that I've never seen anything like that.
It has two spines. It's got a spine. Yeah, of course.
It's amazing.
If you imagine, if you don't look up between 24 in front of you, imagine a book where you look at the whole thing from the top, and instead of one spine that forms a kind of very squashed N, what you have is another spine sewn onto the bottom of that N that brings back up, and it makes a Z shape. But it means you're two books bound into the same object. I can't imagine. Yes, you can make that digitally, but there's no point making that digitally because the thing is a physical object.
Well, it's sort of
in the way it's read.
Yeah, I mean the thing that I come back to every time is the fact that the core atom of digital versus print are incompatible.
Yeah.
As in the core structure of a book is basically pages, paper. Yeah. That's how everything is built up from. But the core sort of structural atom for digital is the feedback loop. You do something, you get a response, and that is just a completely different thing. And it's sort of like you trying to replicate a page-like experience through a series of feedback loops. It's literally like trying to build a game of reading. You know, it's the same sort of thing. You're trying to replicate a physical artifact through a series of interactions, and you can do it, but it's not the most effective use of that medium. And it's sort of just doing the beautiful physical, the beautiful interaction and the beautiful page are just two things that are so completely different that they lend themselves to different things. Yeah. There is such a thing as a very beautiful interaction where you do something and it's just like, oh my god, wow, that was awesome. Yeah. But it's just it's describing and showing and doing a completely different thing, and that sort of ties into what you said in your manifesto, in that, you know, print has its thing that it can do, and that core foundation it's built on is completely different. And digital has another thing that it does, and the stuff that it can do really, really well are things that print can't do well.
Completely, and there are obviously for me, these are not polar opposites. These are not things that never meet. That there are things that books can do that are
crossover.
Yeah, it's a Venn diagram. There's a crossover. There's a spectrum. That's somewhere in the middle. There are things that books can do that nod or antecedents of interactive behaviour, of digital behaviour, of what, as you say, absolutely, this is a feedback loop. And there are things that digital can do that certainly borrow from the affordances of print, that borrow from the way pages work. And we talk about that in the book a little bit. We can talk about it more, but we talk about that in the book in terms of things like Robin Sloane's Fish. Yeah. That certainly, although it's a purely digital thing and it relies on a feedback loop, plays with how we read, with how we read in a sequence and the pace at which we read. And the other book, which I've probably mentioned before we start to think about finishing this, is Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, which for me is still the thing that points toward digital most clearly in print. Yeah. As an object that absolutely is a thing that exists in print and a thing that is designed to be read as a print object, but that acknowledges the existence of digital technology, is designed digitally, and would almost be impossible to design. Well, it's not impossible to design.
It would be very hard.
It would be an awful lot of work, and more work than they necessarily put into it to make this thing work. But it nods toward those feedback loops, those layers of reading where you are working your way in a non-linear manner through. Do you know House of Leaves? Yeah.
I mean, it's also just so goddamn playful.
It is.
I mean, it's sort of, and that in itself is a very digital thing. The whole sort of idea that we're being playful around these things, which is it's the natural thing to do on digital, and it sort of Yeah,
and it's. Maybe that what we're saying, if what we're saying is that the feedback loop is the building block of digital, and the thing that, you know, you do something and something else happens is the primary kind of marker of it, and the primary marker of a print book is the physical thing about the object and our relationship with that, and maybe a little more time on picking that rather than transposing one thing into another. One of the things, and there's a piece in This Is Not a Book called the House of Leaves Memo, which is kind of my attempt to write a letter to Mark Danielewski saying, for God's sake, don't ever, ever, ever make House of Leaves an ebook. Just don't. Because there's nothing about that book. You could translate it as a sequence of JPEGs, completely fine, make a PDF of it, and it would sit quite happily on an iPad. But none of the playfulness, none of the joy of it, none of the uncanny reading experience would, for my money, translate properly. None of it would work, because the book is a thing. The book that the House of Leaves is an object that demands to be read in non-linear order, that demands that you play with it, demands that you understand the weight of 800 pages of not 800 pages of text by any means. There's much less text than it first appears, and much less story and more story than it first appears. But but it has that relationship with you as a reader, and it absolutely attends to the thing we started talking about first of all, in terms of where are you in the book? How do you have a relationship with this as an object? Where are we within any one of the 3 or 4 nested narratives that work within that book? And how are we reading that? And how do we know how to go back and forward? And that for me is something that print does well. Digital can do, and it can nod to, but we need to spend more time unlocking that.
I mean, we keep coming back to a thing that is very controversial in the among both digital-oriented people, like the digerati or whatever you want to call them, and the literati, which are the sort of literary and print people, is the idea that you don't want to turn everything into an ebook. Yeah. And that is actually such a controversial thing to say, apparently. It's one of those things that people pick upon the most frequently out of anything that I've said or you've said, that I've sort of heard. And that the idea that you know, some books just shouldn't be go into digital, and that some ebooks should just stay ebooks and not ever be printed. That just people just are flabbergasted at the idea that you'd dare say that thing.
The first time I got into an argument, it's not the first time I got into an argument. I've been in many arguments. The first time I got called out by a publisher on it was Peter Smith's City, which is a beautiful thing. It's a really nicely designed. Peter Smith is a writer who's interested in the city as an organism, as an object, as a historical thing, as a thing that we have a cultural relationship with, and he reviews The Guardian. He's a very nice man. And City is kind of, I would describe it as a kind of coffee table academic text. It's very well written, it's very erudite, it's very smart.
It's a beautiful book.
It's a beautiful book, and it's designed really, really well. It's thoughtful. It's designed to be something that you put on your shelf and you show people, as well as reading it. And the Kindle edition is I'm going to say was, because I've not actually looked at any updates. So I kind of refused to after a while. When the Kindle edition first came out, it was an abomination. It was
I remember.
Completely horrible, because it all it did was take those InDesign files and just slap them badly. Very, very badly, with none of the nuance, none of the thought, none of anything. And for me, that was a text that should not have been put in any digital. And I can't. The only reason to put it in a digital edition I could think of in that format was some ridiculous idea about sales and ridiculous idea about convenience. And it's just that's not. You're missing the point. You're completely misunderstanding what that book is and what that book is for and how we want to read it.
I mean, sort of a decent benchmark that I've used in the past is that if you can imagine a mass market paperback version of that book, then it will do okay as an ebook.
Yeah.
But sort of if you can't to sort of boil it down to the gunky, awful paper and crap printing of a mass market paperback, then you can't boil it down to an ebook. If it can't survive the transition to a mass market paperback, it won't survive the transition to an ebook, because ebooks. And I say this as somebody who makes a living making them. Ebook platforms universally suck. They are awful. They are just, the typography is still awful, even with the latest updates. The design is awful. The navigation is awful. The representation of images is awful. The structure is awful. Everything's awful. They're just awful. They're bad websites. They're not even good websites. You can make good websites. You can't really make a good ebook, except just if you make an ebook that doesn't require anything in terms of navigation, like a novel. You can make those fine.
You can put them through.
But anything more ambitious than that, and you're throwing stuff out. You're just doing stuff that is just going to be massively compromised.
That's completely true. And maybe the last thing that I want to kind of say, because we're kind of running out of time, I suppose.
We are.
Is Peter Mayer's Breaking the Page. And I wanted to read this as a print copy. I really wanted to read it in a print edition. And in this country, you can't buy it.
Really?
You can't buy a print edition.
That's just...
It's available on Amazon.com. It's not available on Amazon.uk. I couldn't find a copy on Abe. I couldn't find a copy on any other second-hand sites or the used book sites. So all I could buy was the Kindle edition. And it just seemed to me, I was reading this and really enjoying his prose and really enjoying the arguments and kind of running alongside him. But the reading the book in that format made his argument for him.
Yeah.
It was a really peculiarly kind of disconcerting.
I like to read it.
ridden experience of this book that is railing against e-text. And
do you think that maybe that the reason why that is because he hasn't sold the UK rights for the book and he's self-published the UK version?
I think that's entirely possible. I think honestly, it's I can't. You know the industry in that respect much better than I do, and other people will tell me things. Mess. But yeah, it's the kind of book I would love to read it in a printed edition because its argument would be better made. It's
also,
the sequence.
I saw the pictures that Craig Mod posted of the print edition, and that looks really nice.
And it's a really nice thing, and the e-edition is just it's completely broken. Anyway.
But yeah, no, it's so basically some things are good, some things are bad, and the whole is. When you mix them together, is sort of interesting. That's basically the conclusion of the.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay. So there we are. We're done. Thank you if you made it to the end.
You're a better person than we are.
We're still talking. There are no podcast extras on this, and we will see you next time.
Excellent.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.